The fact that we live in a class society, I think, is starker than ever, isn't it, when you look around? And I think there's also a greater consciousness just of how deep the class divide is in modern Britain. I mean, look at our ruling class, for instance. What does it look like? We have a government that was born and bred for power, wasn't it? They met on the same playing fields, they went to the same schools, they went to the same universities. There is a majority millionaires in the cabinet. That's more millionaires than women. You have a sense of these people come from that thin layer. But even if you look beyond the Tories, even if you look beyond the Tory cabinet and you look at the whole of Westminster, more than 1/3 privately educated. More than a quarter went to Oxford, that is Oxford or Cambridge. Just 2 universities in the whole of Britain. That's how many of the people in Parliament went to those. And, these are the people that they, play polo together, sometimes with the royals and lords and ladies, sometimes with big businessmen, sometimes with media barons, perhaps the odd police chief. You can see how the ruling class is intertwined when the corruption scandals happen. Hacking turns into, it's not really about hacking celebrities, it's all about corruption and everybody in each other's pockets. That's what the ruling class looks like. They own and control wealth and power in society, a tiny elite at the top of society. And then there's the rest of us. Now, we obviously do still hear sometimes bleating from politicians that we're all in this together. I don't think anybody thinks that, do they? I think the crisis is exposing the reality of class society in the true nature of it in all its brutality in recent years. And class shapes every aspect of our lives. Class shapes how long we live, what we might die for. It shapes how tall we grow. And we learn today, it shapes how good you get to be when you're reading when you're a kid. That some boys from poorer backgrounds are 2.5 years behind some boys of the same age from the richest backgrounds in Britain. It shapes everything. And what we're going to do today is look at what class is. It can mean a lot of different things to different people. For some people, it's just about economic inequality between the rich and the poor. The Times rich list versus the council estate. For others, it's just about bigotry against people that they think are lower class. The idea of chavs and scroungers, demonising people who live in council estates. I mean, epitomised by a dreadful woman who, anybody who's actually associated with the Apprentice programme is pretty dreadful. But Katie Hopkins, did you see her? She says she doesn't allow her children to play with children with names like Charlene or Chardonnay, because they're lower class and they're the sort of kids that are late with their homework and they really are no-hopers. And she wouldn't dream of letting her children mix with those. Pure bigotry. And when you look, you see, the myths that for us as Marxists and socialists that we're constantly challenging, one of the myths is, well, class is no longer relevant, we're all sort of in the middle. There might be a few very rich and a few very poor, but really everybody else is sort of in the middle. And things are very different now. Things have fundamentally changed than the olden days when there was workers who wore flat caps, and then there was the bosses who wore the top hats. Now, I want to say things have changed, but the fundamental nature of class in capitalism hasn't. And one of the most recent sort of studies of it, which tried to say everything's very different now and all the rest of it, was a BBC and LSE, a London University academic study about class, and they claimed they discovered 7 different classes in Britain. They declared the old-fashioned way that it was a Victorian system, and it was a throwback to an earlier time in Britain's social history. And it said they found these 6 elite classes to go from a 6% elite at one end, and the precariat, they claim, at the bottom, and in between was the established middle class, new affluent workers, the traditional working class, and emergent service workers. And really, I don't know, did some of you do the survey? I did it. But, it asks you questions about whether you like the opera, whether you ate out, these sorts of things. Did you have people of other ethnic backgrounds living in your street, and these sorts of things to say, and did you use social media? These in some way were meant to demote what class you're in. Now, they claimed that they had a more sophisticated view of class than just about money and economic inequality. And they referenced Pierre Bourdieu to talk about cultural and social capital. And they, in reflection of these ideas, they asked people, did they have friends who included solicitors, doctors, or MPs? Now, I think, of course, access to powerful social networks is an important thing about how you can get by in society. It has an impact. But really, to say these define your class, because I looked at it, well, I know some solicitors. Jim Nichol, Matt Foote, Doctors, Canvas Bulmer, I know him too. MPs, Well, I'm on the National Officers Group of the Stop the War Coalition. I know Jeremy Corbyn. My social capital leapt up when I did the survey. But did it actually make any difference to me? Yeah, am I suddenly a member of, the bourgeoisie? I don't think so. These are the trappings of class. They are not its determining features. You cannot reduce class to individual consumer choices, whether you like the opera, whether you eat fish and chips. This is superficial snapshots of people's lifestyles. You can't reduce it to that. And it's not, class isn't actually even simply a category or a strata in a pile. It's not just even a description of inequality. Because these sort of static views of class, they both rob the system of the dynamism that's at the heart of the system, which I want to explain, but it also robs the working class, the majority of class, of any sense of agency and ability to change the situation. It's a description, if you look at the working class as just being poor, as Marx refers to in the Communist Manifesto, he says this is like seeing the working class as the most suffering class, without seeing that actually it can do something about its suffering. I mean, this is really what I would call the Polly Toynbee sort of approach to class, which is look at the poor. And it's true there are the poor. It's true that even though there is the working poor, but actually to see it simply as that is not right. So today, this meeting really is about what's wrong with that view and to show that Marx had a fundamentally different definition of class. It's not about what people think about their position in class society. It's not even about what an individual actually does in terms of their job or even what they earn. Class is about an objective social relationship in the system between the exploited and the exploiter. There are middling, complicating factors which I'll come back to, but I want to essentially look at this objective social relationship in the system between those who own and control the means of production and those that have to sell their labour power, their ability to labour. They don't sell what they do, they sell their ability to work. And therefore, for us to understand class, we always have to start from the system as a totality, not a snapshot of an individual, of their job or their earnings, but looking at the system as a unity of opposites, with the inherent contradiction of a tiny elite that wants to exploit the majority in order, driven by the need to get profits. And so therefore, static categories don't really give you that insight, do they? But a social relationship between the exploiter and the exploited does. And therefore class exists only in as much as you have two classes antagonistic to each other. And this means that all the other trappings that I described before, that survey looked at, and endless sociological surveys talk about, whether it's accent, clothes, lifestyle, culture, and all the rest of it. All of these flow from this fundamental relationship. They don't cause it, they are reflections of this thing. So, when you look at it, the trappings of class are actually very different. I talked about flat caps. I mean, sometimes flat caps are a bit trendy, but it isn't like, what workers wear now that matters. And workers go on holiday abroad, which 40 years ago would not have happened. Have access to all sorts of consumer goods that 40 years ago our parents and grandparents wouldn't have had. The ruling class might go around wearing jeans and go to football matches. But actually, so these things are not static in terms of the superficial look of class, but at the bottom of it is this relationship. And I think it's critical to remember that this exploitative class relationship is about the ruling class. It isn't just that they own the factories, they do, but the factories don't make the profits. The factories aren't the things that generate the wealth and the profit. It's the workers. It's our ability to labour. It's not things that make a profit. They make a profit by employing workers and paying them less than the value of the work that they do. That's the heart. If we get that, if we don't get anything else out of today's meeting, if we get that social relationship and the minority exploitment, that this is the kernel of capitalism, it's that dynamic, that antagonistic contradiction that drives it forward. And I think this is why partly also helps explain why struggle is intrinsic to the capitalist class system, because that constant push me pull you between the majority of workers and the elite ruling class, the bosses, to extract more and to hold on to more. It's a constant thing. Sometimes it's visible. 2.6 million public sectors strike. Electricians strike. That's visible, isn't it? Struggle, class struggle, out in the street. You can see the picket lines. Sometimes it's invisible. Well, I'm bloody well just going to stay on Facebook for another half an hour. I don't care if my supervisor tells me I've got to get on with something else. That in itself is a bit of a challenge to the boss. Time to myself. Stay a bit longer in the loo. Leave 5 minutes before this. All of this is invisible, isn't it? But it's still that contradiction, still that tension that you get. And therefore, when you see this, then you can understand that why the class divide isn't just about workers being victims, isn't it just about them being the most suffering class and the rich being this, elite that wallows in wealth in some static way. It actually shows you why workers have the potential for immense political and economic power. Now, I started by saying, people tell us everything's so different now and everything. And many people look at this and say, nah, it's just old hat. That doesn't really fit today. But to be honest, what's interesting is generation after generation are told this sort of analysis of class doesn't fit. Over the years, it almost seems, every few decades, there's somebody else saying, oh, that's all old hat, this is different. I mean, the German philosopher Herbert Marcuse claimed in 1965 that changes in lifestyle had fundamentally changed the nature of the working class, of the class system. He said, why should the overthrow of the existing order be a vital necessity for people who own, or can hope to own, good clothes, a well-stocked larder, a TV set, a car, a house, and so on, all within the existing order? Again, looking at the trappings, not understanding the social relationship. Again, the French theorist Andrew Gortz wrote a book in 1980 called Farewell to the Working Class, argued that automation, flexible working hours, job sharing and all the rest of it had fundamentally changed the nature of the class divide. Remember, he was the same man who famously, in January 1968, wrote that in the foreseeable future there'll be no crisis of capitalism so dramatic as to drive the mass of workers to revolutionary general strikes or armed insurrection in defence of their interests. Only months before, 1968, greatest general strike in European history. So that sense of constantly thinking that things are fundamentally different within the system, but not understanding that it hasn't. Now, that's not to deny that there has been change. Of course there's been change. But it's constantly going back to where is the change, what does it mean, and where is that social relationship, and how much is that being challenged. And the fact is, Marx always recognised that the thing about capitalism, it is a dynamic system. That sense of always in flux, the drive to create profits, the new technology, more efficient production. This is something that has been a constant. Parts of the Communist Manifesto, they're a praise of capitalism, aren't they? Talking about it's given us this, it's given us that, because the sheer productive capacity that is given. Now, obviously, for us as socialists, we know now that those relations of production, if you like, are a fetter on us. They're ruining the planet, they're making people poor and starve when there's no need. But for the moment, it's actually understanding that capitalism is constantly in change. And, this idea of the constant revolutionising of the means of production is something that is intrinsic to capitalism. It isn't something just recent, that, oh goodness, we don't have those textile mills, now we've got call centres. Or this is something that's absolutely intrinsic. I mean, Marx said this, he said, the process of capitalism and the dynamic of capitalism, all old established industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries whose introduction becomes a life and death question. Constantly that drive to get profit forces them into new ways. And so, in Marx's day, it might have been mills being replaced by textiles, weaving, etc. The sense of even when he was writing, things were already getting out of date. Today, we have the same thing. But nevertheless, society still relies on the exploitation of the majority by the minority. That is what capitalism rests on. That's what the system is. And actually, far from the working class as part of this system disappearing, I mean, in Marx's day, it was a tiny minority of humanity, in a tiny geographical pocket of the world. Actually, the system sucks ever more people into that class, whether globally or even within Britain itself. Now, often at these sort of meetings, we can spend quite a lot of time saying, right, who's in a particular class? What about a primary school teacher in a rural school with only 2 teachers? What about Tesco's checkout manager who perhaps has 2 people below her or him? There are people on the spectrum that are intermediate, middle managers, self-employed people. There is layers of people that are not part of the proletariat, as Marx would call it, and the ruling class. There is intermediate layers, and we can spend time going through individual jobs. I'm not sure how useful those things are, though. Feel free. But I think, what do we talk about with people in the intermediate or middle class? Sometimes, again, it can be used in a sociological way. A teacher can be described as middle class, whereas actually I would say the teachers unions are part of, a part of the working class. So I don't want to use it in a sociological way. I'm talking about people in the middle. They actually have much more control over production than ordinary workers do, but they face contradictory pressures. They can be pulled both ways. And I think that's what's interesting. They're not separate from capitalism's class divide. And they can take on features of both of its main classes. Marx put it this way. He talked about how capitalism has simplified the class antagonisms, keeps pushing people into these two great camps of bosses and workers. I mean, that can be oversimplified, and it can sound, we have to be careful not to be mechanical and crude about it, but we have to understand that process, if you like. But he understood, when I mentioned teachers, if you think of layers of jobs, who even when I was growing up would have been very esteemed, prestigious jobs, a lecturer, a university lecturer, or a teacher or whatever, they would have been jobs that have been seen as prestigious big jobs. But what capitalism does, and this is what Marx said, he said it strips of its halo every occupation hitherto honoured. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage labourers. And we have seen that today, the proletarianisation of, that's a nice big long word, got it out in one, of what happens to many jobs. The white collar work, manual workers hoping their kids would have a chance not to be in unsafe, dirty conditions doing manual work, hoping that they will do white collar work. The expansion of white collar work, where people might have thought this is going to be a better job for me, I'll have more control over it, and then these people having keystrokes being measured, phone calls being listened into by supervisors, the control is immense, and actually new technology is helping do that, making people feel like little bits, little cogs in a bigger wheel, in a way that really people couldn't have imagined would have been even technically possible, let alone humanly, sufferable. And I think that's what we're seeing with a whole layer of people. And I think, so obviously, there still is the middling and intermediate layers, but I think to understand the system of class, we have to understand that social relationship that defines all other parts of society. And then I just wanted to look at the sense of the reality of how people experience class, and what does that mean about arguments and debates about class, and also how things could be different. Because, we talk about the ruling class. Are they conscious of their interests? Well, sometimes they are. I think they definitely are. When they sit round and say, right, well, our system's in crisis, isn't it? We're going to have to sit down here and make sure we're not the ones who pay the price. And what they're doing across Europe are trying to make us pay, aren't they? That's what austerity is all about. Austerity also isn't just about getting out of this crisis. It's about a crisis that gives us an excuse to smash all the things that workers have fought for over many, many years. So the conscious, yes. But you see, let's remember, bosses are not part of the ruling class just because they're sort of greedy bastards, many of them are. They're driven to do what they're doing because of their class position. That's what drives them to do what they do. It isn't because of some human frailty, if you like, that they're in that system and they exploit people and oppress people. It is because of their class position drives them to do that. And this is what we have to understand about class, that it isn't just about individuals, and I'll come back to that in terms of our side. But so therefore the bosses themselves as a class, they are both compete with each other, whether it's different sections of capital, whether it's different national states with big capitals within it, they compete with each other. Marx called them a band of warring brothers. So they're warring in the sense that they want to constantly grab markets and profits for each other, but they're brothers in the sense they're united in one thing, screwing us. And so that sense of the contradiction even within themselves we have to understand, because if we see it in too simplistic a way, we can fail to see what's actually going on within modern capitalism. But the other thing that the bosses do is they don't just own and control the means of production, they also own and control the mental means of production. I referred to the media and the state and the police and everybody else playing on polo matches, drinking champagne together, whatever it is. You actually have a situation where I think the role that the media plays, in terms of its relationship with the ruling class, is very interesting. But it is true that the media plays a very important role in trying to, when it goes in immigration scares or whatever, trying to whip up ideas that will divide us, keep us down, and not fail to point the finger upwards to who the real enemy is. And this means that any, Marx's phrase of the ideas of any society are the ideas of the ruling class means that, their ideas are the dominant, they have hegemony, the ideas of the ruling class, that you have to do an honest day's work for an honest day's money, that actually we've got too many immigrants, that, health tourism is why the health service is being stretched. These are the sort of the ideas of the ruling class pushes on them. But you see, it isn't that simple, is it? Because if that was true, then none of us would be at a thing called Marxism. Nobody would even join a union because they think they couldn't do anything. They think, oh, well, we better work harder because, these are the risk takers and the wealth creators at the top and we need to help them out. But people don't always think that, do they? We're not just empty vessels for rotten ideas that are fed to us by the Murdoch media or anybody else. Again, it goes back to the dynamic at the heart. The contradiction is of this push me pull you of struggle that means that there's always an intrinsic forcing us to say, hang on a minute, why should I not have a pension? Why should I be forced to go and sign on for a lower benefit just because they've changed the law as to what age your child has to be before you can, before you have to be forced to look for work? And therefore, you have to keep coming back to saying this is why understanding of class has to be, you have to see that being part of the working class is not just a description of a category. It means you have agency. It means that you have the ability to challenge your conditions. Because what we have to understand is there's a difference between the objective reality of the position and strength of the working class, what the material reality is. We have the potential. It's objectively true today that we have the potential to challenge the ruling class, to stop the bosses, and to create a social society. That's a reality today, objectively. But contrast that to the subjective feeling of where the working class is at. That's quite different, isn't it? Many people don't feel they've got that power. Many people have racist ideas or sexist ideas or homophobic ideas. Alienation in society, there'll be another meeting on that, but it creates sometimes a veil over the true relations that are going on and makes us think that other things are true, gives us a different sort of common sense that means that it makes us accept some of the rotten ideas that the ruling class wants us to drink up, if you like. But this is my goodness, I've got a little...
I know, it's been there for ages.
Oh my goodness.
The ladybird on the microphone.
A ladybird on the microphone, yeah. Really surreal there, especially with my glasses on, it's very big. So therefore, if all this was... I've lost my track now. If this was all true, if it was just true we were empty vessels, if it was just true the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, then actually there would be a status quo. Capitalism would last forever. That would be how it is, but it's not, because the contradiction of capitalism is by creating a working class that he referred to as a gravedigger of capitalism. It's the constant creating a class that is bigger, more concentrated, more centralized, from little to small workshops of the early years to vast conglomerations where people are brought together. And it's the only way that people can earn a living, because you can't buy food unless you've got money, and you can only get money if you go to work, or if you're unlucky enough not to get work, you have to live on very little from the state. But this is something, again, it isn't the workers, this isn't about lionising workers or anything else and saying that they are most progressive because they've got these great ideas or progressive ideas that they can fight. It's about how they are forced, intrinsic in the system, they're forced to cooperate in their day-to-day work, even just to earn a living. And the struggle at the heart of the system constantly forces them to fight, even if they don't want to, even if they have no class consciousness and wanting to be a militant. I mean, how many times have any of you been on a picket line where people say to you, I'm not a militant, but they went over the line here. They shouldn't have victimised that worker. They shouldn't have done that. That's what, because it's not that the consciousness drives them to fight. It's the system drives people to fight, drives people to become more conscious of the true relationship of class. I mean, the socialist and historian Hal Draper, a wonderful writer, he said there's no evidence that workers like to struggle any more than anyone else. The evidence is that capitalism compels and accustoms them to do so. So it's not like people say, and again, people don't say, I love to strike. I mean, you get SWP members going, yay, a strike. But workers are often going, oh no, goodness, going to lose money. Is the boss going to victimise me? That's the reality. But actually the system compels them to organise collectively to challenge their bosses. So even workers with backward ideas can be pulled into struggle. And this is when, and this is, points to later in the course, when the working class moves from being a class in itself that you can objectively just look at and understand, to being a class for itself, conscious of its own power. And this is where the struggles can turn into something that can challenge things in a much greater way. Because if we're looking at the class divide, if we're saying that society is more polarised than ever, and I think it is. I mean, later on tonight I'm doing a meeting about, Thatcherism and the legacy and all the rest of it. And actually I think Thatcher's death, the expressions of bitterness and anger with Thatcher's death, don't you think it sort of crystallised, didn't it, the feeling about, we hated her, she was a class warrior and we hate this lot. So that sense of polarisation in society, I think, and alongside this crisis, is some of our ideas that might have been harder to win in some other political and historical periods, I think are easier to win in a period like this, where class seems so raw, where it seems so in your face what they're doing, that it is a plan to try to crush our class, to take everything away from us that we fought for. So therefore I think this is why it's very important us to look at the potential for the class to struggle, because one of the themes of Marxism, I think, will be about struggle. Why we want more struggle in Britain. Why aren't we having it? What's going on here? We can see some struggles elsewhere and the nature of struggle and where it comes from. And I think that we have to see the fact that struggle isn't something that can ever just be stopped, even if there wasn't socialists trying to agitate and lead and shape and everything else. You have a situation where even if there wasn't socialists, there would be struggle, because it's intrinsic to how the system is organised. And I think that therefore, when I said it's not about lionising workers, it's about talking about how the working class is a unique place in this system. Again, I think it was Hal Draper who said, an objective agency of social revolution in the process of becoming is that the nature of the position that they are in society, that forces them to struggle, forces them to cooperate, forces them to overcome divisions within the class, the divisions, oppressive divisions if you like. That means that they become the class that not only has the ability to overcome the class system, the ruling class, but it also is the class that that intrinsic division and contradiction forces them to actually have access, if you like, to the potential ideas, to say, actually, we shouldn't be divided. Why am I being racist towards this person who's come from another country? Why is this woman's job worth any less, etc.? And therefore that sense of, again, when I said it's not just that the boss class is full of greedy bastards, there are plenty, it's about their class position. With the working class, even workers, what's the best-selling newspaper? The Sun, full of backward ideas and all the rest of it, but it's the nature of the class position of workers that forces them into a position where it can actually become conscious of its own collective power and actually do something about it. And therefore it has the potential to be a revolutionary class. And we see this around the world, don't we? We see this in Egypt. What was the thing that toppled Mubarak in the end? It was the working class organising as a collective alongside these mass popular protests in the street. Time and time again, that's where the economic power of society is, because that class relationship means that what we do matters. Us going to work makes everything happen. The whole basis of society is based on people like you and me getting up in the morning. Well, not perhaps me, because I'm editing Socialist Worker, but hopefully what we do actually will help challenge it. But the sense of everything that happens, mending the roads, building the hospitals, teaching, you name it, it's because workers do it. And therefore that sense of their power has to be there. And I suppose there you have it. The class that is supposedly just the most suffering class is actually the most powerful class. So you have the exploited class as the powerful class. The exploited class can be the tribune for all the oppressed of humanity, because they're driven to overcome divisions, to have unity in order to fight. The exploited class, the working class, can, through struggles and revolutions and mass uprisings, become the class that can bring about a completely different society. Ironically, the sort of society that won't have class anymore. A socialist society where class will be abolished. And I mean, that's the sort of society we're all fighting for in the SWP. A society where class, the only place you'll find class, will be in the history books. And people won't believe that we lived in a society where a tiny elite were able to exploit and oppress the vast majority of people for so many generations. But I hope those are history books we'll help write.
I was just going to say, I think class is a very important question. And I just wanted to talk about, I went to university in 2008, to a university in Cambridge called Anglo-Ruskin University. And as a party, as Marxists, we say that students, their class position hasn't been decided, but they're a kind of temperature gauge for the class, for the working class very often. And they can move much quicker, but then you either go into the working class or you become managers. And I think amongst a lot of my friends, that's happened in that quite a few of my friends, they thought by the act of going to university, that made them middle class. And since the crisis, a lot of us have been unemployed, in factory work, laid off again, pushed around. I'm unemployed at the moment, I'm being put on workfare. Actually, we're starting to realise that there is a class system. And I joined the SWP quite early, and again in arguments they would say there's not a class thing, Britain's a bit different today, but actually they're starting to realise that class does exist, because it's about your social relationship to the means of producing things and where you stand. And my question would be, with unemployed workers, are they part of the working class or not? And because I get confused over what Marx talks about, the lumpen proletariat, and I also don't like that word as well as an unemployed person, and that's my question. How I just require a bit of clarity on that, but really to say that in a meeting back in Norwich, my comrades in my branch, they said, because I said, well, am I part of the working class? I'm not in the workplace. And they said, are you looking for work? And I said, yes. And what's life like for you not looking for work? And I said, it's really grand. And then they smiled and said, I think you've answered the question there, Tim. So I'll end with that.
Basically, where I work is there are hardly any people in my office, and about 30 people are in the union. I think there's 3 people, including me. And it's weird because, as you were saying, it's never been more evident that there is a class structure in this country, and that it has not gone away, and that it, in fact, has probably been reinforced by the actions of the ruling class. But hardly anyone in my office even knew they were working class. Because I had a discussion about it, and I was saying, I'm working class, we're working class, and they didn't know. So, I mean, I suppose my question is, how is it that people can develop like a false consciousness about they know there are problems, but they can't quite centre the cause of the problems, even though it's so glaringly obvious to me as someone who's taken the red pill, so to speak. But yeah. So that's basically the question.
I just wanted to. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it is on. It sounds.
I just wanted to carry on the discussion about the sort of sociological definitions of class and why they are absolutely and simply wrong. And I want to be very concrete and use me and my brother as a sort of example of that. Me and my brother, both from a council estate. My mum was a cleaner and a factory worker, and my dad was a docker. We both left home, left school semi-illiterate at 15 and 16, and we both went into low-paid factory work. Now, any sociologist, and probably a Marxist as well, would say we were working class, solidly working class. Eventually, I became a probation officer. I got an education and I became a probation officer. My brother eventually got into the steel, and he still is, he's a steel worker, and I'm a probation officer. Now, your sociologist would say the probation officer, middle class. The steel worker, obviously working class. Well, it's very interesting because my brother earns more than me. He's got a bigger house and a more expensive house than me. He goes on amazing holidays that I would never dream of going on, and he has the newest car every single year. Now, I'm not bitter, comrade. I don't want to begrudge him a penny. He should earn more, and I should earn more, right? But we're both working class, and why? And it's what Judith said. Do we have control? Do we own the means of production? Either of us? No. Do we both sell our labour? Absolutely yes. We are both working class because it's about that relationship. And just briefly on the idea of the proletarianisation, which is a hard way to say, of things of people like teachers and probation officers and social workers. In terms of control over your job, and if people are sat here who are social workers and teachers and as a probation officer, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, yeah, I think we did have a reasonable amount of control. Now, comrades, it's an absolute nightmare. I'm not mourning because all workers are under this, right? It's a nightmare where you have so little control. So they are proletarianised it. And we've lost a lot of, there were perks maybe 30 years ago in terms of your average certain factory worker, but they've gone as well. They are proletarianised it.
Judith mentioned a number of studies which aren't all that useful, the ones she talked about, the BBC and the LSE. But there is one study, I think, that kind of starts to show that there is what Marx talked about in terms of a polarisation of two contending classes. Of course, there's a middle class and so on. I don't know if anyone's heard of a guy called Greg Philo. Greg Philo is a research professor at Glasgow University, and he did this study about all the income in Britain in 2010. And it amounted, every single penny, pound, whatever, amounted to £9,000 million, right? The top 10%, how much do you think of that £9,000 million? £4,000 billion. 44% of the wealth, right? The bottom 50%, right? How much did they share? 9%. 9% of the total income. That's quite shocking, really. And actually, it gives you a sense, doesn't it, about the kind of, I know it's not, it doesn't tell the whole story, but it gives you a sense, doesn't it, of the kind of the crumbs, the crumbs from the rich man's table. And you see, it's interesting as well because that's you could kind of conjecture about that 40% in the middle, yeah. Because some of them will be, the managers that bully us and give us targets and kick our asses and all the rest of it, but some of them will be part of the working class. But some of those managers and bullies will be in that 50% as well. Some of them aren't paid that greatly, certainly the people that manage me in the call centre. And I think the key thing is about power. When I started working a call centre that raised money for charities, it was very common. You'd go in there and be a manager go, right, you're gone, you've not got enough. You've got not enough kind of pledges. You've gone, you're using the mobile phone. You've gone, you've used the toilet too much, and so on. The power dynamic started to change when we started to organise, and actually when people started to get together to start to discuss collectively about what we do about it. And it got to the point, brothers and sisters, where actually it became a joke. They couldn't sack anyone. They sacked me, got reinstated. Sacked someone else, got reinstated. We won time and time again because actually we had power. We do the work. We had power, we could change that situation. Thanks.
Good afternoon, comrades. It's one of the things I've noticed about the people that have spoken before me. There's been quite a few northern accents among the people that have spoken, and I'm kind of thinking, because I'm actually a Londoner myself, and there seems to be that class consciousness is different in different parts of the country, and certainly in Yorkshire, the northwest, and the northeast. It's much higher than it is in London and the southeast, and I'm wondering how Northern comrades can help us down south raise more higher levels of class consciousness in Essex and so forth. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Excuse me, do you want to carry on outside? Because I'm going to struggle to get everybody in already.
Hi. There's been an argument going around. I know Judith said we don't necessarily want to argue about the particular class position of this or that kind of worker, but there's been an argument going around that public service workers are relatively privileged and they're less likely to be leaders of the revolution, the most important part of the revolutionary class. And I think it's actually quite a dangerous argument for two reasons. One is that it's divisive, and I believe that the working class needs to be as united as possible to be effective. The other is that by allowing it to be divisive, you play into the hands of those people who want to divide us and to contrast the strivers and the scroungers and the aspiring and the rest of it. And as a matter of fact, when you look at public service workers, how bloody privileged are they? I mean, how privileged is a classroom assistant, a healthcare assistant, a bin worker? And there's a whole lot of people who might be in areas of work that have been privatised who still, to me quite rightly, regard themselves as part of the public sector. I mean, the posties are part of the public sector today. In a couple of weeks, will they still be? I reckon they will be. And so are the people who drive the buses, so are the people who drive the trains. They do us a public service. I think that's really important. And the other thing that I find is really important, you go down on a picket line to show solidarity. And, okay, I mean, I was privileged as a teacher. I give you that. I did a job I loved doing, and not everybody has that joy. I did a job I loved doing. I had relative autonomy, as has been said in the classroom. Very few teachers can say that nowadays. The bullying bosses, the target setting, the taking away your autonomy, denying the value of what you're doing, rubbishing you and blaming you for the ills of society. And then another thing I'd like to say, you can't always know which sector is going to lead the revolution. You look at the revolution in Egypt, there were massive strikes in the Mahalla factories. But, I mean, who would have thought that tax collectors would be leaders of a revolution? And there have been strikes among doctors now.
It's
relatively privileged. And just a very last point, I think that we actually have to fight particularly hard to defend the right of people in the public sector to strike, not only because they have the right themselves to defend their jobs and wages, but because they're defending the services that we all need and use and rely on. So, to hell with them.
Hi, good morning. I just had to come up and say something because I've got a wee story to tell you about class. Now, I've worked most of my life in the hospitality industry. By the way, would you hear me, yeah? I've worked most of my life in the hospitality industry. Now, if there's an industry that tells you the difference between the working classes and the so-called upper classes, that is an industry. Because you're serving the food and drink to these people. Now, I worked at the Scottish Open a few years back, and the chief executive of Pepsi was there, chief executive of Pepsi UK, and he says, can I get some cigars? I said, yes sir. He says, would you hold on, we'll get you a list on the price list. Oh, do you know who I am? I'm like, I don't give a shit who you are. You have to pay that the same as everybody else. You don't get it for free. That's just separate from what you've been given. I want to see your manager. So the manager comes along, the manager just turns around and says exactly the same thing as I said. But eventually he capitulated and said, oh, there you go, yeah, there we are. So these people, they look down on us. And there's other places where you can see them as well, quite easily. The lady there mentioned football matches earlier on. You can't tell the difference when you're looking at them at football matches. Yes, you can, because they all sit in hospitality suites with their suits on, their collars and ties on, and they might have a scarf. Depends on what club they go to. Some of the clubs don't allow them to wear scarves in those hospitality suites. But there they are. They're there. And you can't tell the difference, because, again, they're looking down from the top, right down on top of everybody. That is where they want to be. They just want to look down on top of us all the time. They want you to go, well, there you go, sir. And that's it. Right, I'm going to wind up. That's been finished now.
No.
I just want to make a couple of points. The thing about the cultural aspects of class, there was in the early 60s, the Scala Opera House, they used to give a free concert when there was a new opera with carols on the steps of the Opera House. And eventually the management of the Fiat Park gave people the afternoon off. And the reason they gave people the afternoon off was because if they didn't give the workers the afternoon off, they just marched down there en masse to see Maria Callas. Now, you can't actually say that opera is bourgeois in Britain, but it's proletarian culture in Italy. This is nonsensical. This is about access to culture more than anything else. The other point I really want to make is about a lot of the stuff that's coming up about the underclass, the precariat, and I think the central important thing when we're talking about class, about your relationship with the means of production, which is why all this stuff about people being middle class because they like opera is nonsensical. But I think this stuff about the precariat, the underclass, is actually very, very dangerous, because it's actually trying to, it's a bit like the fact that the Tories are actually trying to foment civil war within the working class as to the strivers and the shirkers, and it actually can actually feed into that. And I think that obviously there have been unemployed unions in the past, but for example, where I come from in Portsmouth, the Unite Community branch is actually organising unemployed workers and actually say, you are part of the working class, you can make a difference. And they're the people who, because they've got a bit of time on their hand, are actually doing the leafleting, organising the campaigns against the bedroom tax, and the cutbacks we're having against the short start centre. So I think it's actually, I'd like Judith to come back on this, but I think this thing about, when you're actually talking about the subclass, it's very easy for people, the choice to jump to treating people like as if they're subhuman. And I think it's very, very dangerous, all this precariat, underclass business, working class unemployed. It's important we actually push this through. I think it's divisive and actually very, very dangerous.
I know people, a lot of people obviously are thinking, well, put my hands up. Loads of people have put their hands up. I'm trying to keep people to time to get as many in as possible. I think I've seen pretty much everybody's put their hands up, but there's no guarantee, because I've got quite a lot of people and not much time.
I just wanted to come back to sort of why Marxists and socialists sort of go on about class so much, because we're living in a situation where we're constantly told this is not really very relevant anymore, or it just doesn't exist at all, and yet we keep harping on and on about it. And I think Judith mentioned Hal Draper quite a few times, but I think that what he said about the attempts to rubbish Engels' ideas on women and oppression are quite relevant here, because he sort of, when he talks about how academics just dismiss, the Marxist explanation for women's oppression, he says the reason they're doing that is the issue they have is with his method and its revolutionary implications. And I think that's why they're trying to say that class is irrelevant, because there are revolutionary implications. And that's why we stress it so much. It's not because we're interested particularly in what class people are or whatever. It's because it opens up the way of changing the world. It points to the force that can actually overthrow capitalism and create a new society. And I just want to come back to the question about unemployed. I mean, I would say that unemployed workers are part of the working class. I think there's sort of a a kind of ideology that there are these permanent groups of people, like so the unemployed are the unemployed, as they put it, like they're permanently out of work, this underclass thing. Whereas it's not true, people do move in and out of the workforce quite fluidly. So I would say people are part of the working class. And I think it's important, there's probably not much time to go through it, but the precariat and all this sort of thing. I mean, the reason I think why Judith was right to sort of stress the relationship is that that's what you have to ask, isn't it? Like, are these people being exploited? Are their exploiters getting profit from them? If they stopped working, would that stop? Yes. Of course, there are all kinds of different things on top of that put barriers in the way of people fighting back. But, these people are most definitely still part of the working class and still have power to change the world.
My question's a bit probably overly self-explanatory to someone, but I just need it to be clarified. You talked about that there's a middle class, and people often talk about there isn't a two-class system anymore because there's an emerging middle class, and I was looking at neo-Marxist ideas of the reason for why there's a middle class, but due to the ruling class being 1%, they need to utilise the so-called middle class to be able to divide and use them as a tool for being able to keep control. And I wanted to hear your views on that. And also I wanted to talk about how working class people supposedly make it in the whole American dream sense of the word. If you take your Adele, if you take your Alan Sugar, they're really working class and they worked really hard. And is that just a ploy to say they let one or two people trickle through every now and again you know, it's a bit of bread and circuses idea of just to make us go, see, look, there was one person, that means they've got a shot, and I just wanted to see your view on that, or if it's just me having a bit of a delusional idea of where that comes from. So those 2 points to be cleared up, that'd be really useful.
Hello, good morning all. Just a couple of things really. What we're talking about here, and it's been mentioned a couple of times already, is perception of class. And I know you mentioned about the intermediate layers, but the way I explained it at a course I was at last year is how long can you go without receiving a paycheck? And most of us live month to month, and some of us are far exceeding that as well. So if you can't go more than a couple of paychecks, then you're not middle class, you're working class. And that goes for our bosses as well. Most of them like to think, you know, because they run on a golf course with one of the CEOs or whatever they think to be, that they're in fact middle class. As far as struggle in the UK goes, I would say that the UK will take to struggle just as soon as the soap's finished, but before X Factor starts. The majority of people out there are too distracted by television because TV is gone. And that's because the media is selling us a lie every day. That's why people believe that they're not working class anymore. The media is the film, television, music and the news. They're selling us every day the lie that we're not working class anymore and that we're middle class. And people believe it because they release credit. They got access to credit cards with television, so you've got flat screen TV, I have a mobile phone, I've got Sky. I can't be working class, I must be middle class. You don't see old bangers driving around out there anymore because everyone's got a car and HP. I'm not working class anymore, I'm middle class. And this is how they've managed to convince the people out there they're not working class anymore. So what we've got to fight is the perception of class and try and break that cycle. And I guess I will just finish with George Carlin, who said that it's called the American Dream, but you have to be asleep to believe it.
When Judith was speaking, she talked about, rightly I think, that how much you earn is not a measure of whether you're working class or not. And the measure of whether you're working class or not is whether, in order to live, you have to sell your ability to work. And I think that's absolutely right. It also struck me as she spoke to think, yes, but actually, who are the people who end up having to go to the food kitchens? And I bet there are many, many people who are going to those food kitchens right now around the country who never ever dreamt that this was where it would come to, that perhaps they did have TVs, perhaps they did have mobile phones and washing machines and all of those things. It didn't stop them actually being driven into the most terrible poverty by the system. And I think often Marxist terms have become very vague in the way they're used. Exploitation is one of those words. You know, people say, what disgraceful exploitation, meaning I'm shocked at how badly those people are treated and how badly they're paid. Now, a friend of mine I think illustrated this very well. He said, I'm not a red, I'm a kind of nice shade of pink. And he's a great guy called trade unionist. He has a very, very good, interesting, well-paid, creative job of the sort that many, many people would love to have. And he once said to me, actually, you're one paycheck away from the streets. He knows it, lots of workers know it. So class consciousness, again, is not about how well you're paid. It's about your perception of your relationship to the system of production. But somebody asked, why is it that workers don't all understand this? And it is a perennial problem for us, that actually the ruling class, I do believe, absolutely understand exactly what they're about. Yeah. Rupert Murdoch knows exactly what he's getting put into the sun, and yet workers tend not to. And, again, Judith talked about the ideas of the ruling class often are able to be dominant. They have the power over the media and all of those things. And therefore they can throw in all sorts of things, confuse us about nationality, about race, about all of those sorts of things. There's lots of ways that they can throw in all those sorts of divisive ideas that confuse us. Somebody also talked about the north-south, a sense of a north-south divide. I'm an economic migrant to Manchester from London. I think it's actually about how well we're organised. And it's also about the politics, therefore, of when you find yourself, you're forced into struggle. Of course, you're forced onto the picket line, then there it is, stark in front of you, that the white boss is going in, that your black colleague is there on the picket line. And it is, when at this point, class struggle in Britain at least is not at particularly high point. Actually that can change, and in that process actually also we will find workers' ideas start to change as well.
Yes, Tim asked earlier about unemployed people, whether we should consider them as working class. I think absolutely unequivocally unemployed people are part of the broader working class. When Marx talks about class, he has a broad and narrow conception of the working class. At the core, you have those people who directly sell their labour power to the system. Surrounding them, you have broader layers of people who indirectly depend on them, their children, elderly people, and so on, who depend on that wage relationship. And then you have wider layers of people who are part of what Marx called the reserve army of labour, who are cast out of employment when capitalism has no function for them, but are drawn back in. Imagine if we had a boom like in the 1950s, the vast majority of the unemployed would be pulled into often quite low-paid jobs to keep the boom going. Those people are part of the working class. The term that Tim asked about, the lumpen proletariat, when Marx talked about lumpen proletariat, he was talking about a very different group of people. He talked about those people as the debris of all classes. Those people who couldn't function in capitalism as it developed as a contemporary society and were cast out into criminality and vagabondage, as Marx puts it. It's a very, very small layer of people and a quite different group of people in society. It has nothing in common with the layers of the reserve army of labour. That's quite important because that group, the so-called lumpen proletariat, if you look at the work of, say, Guy Standing, who wrote a terrible, terrible book called The Precariat, the New Dangerous Class. For him, that layer of people have expanded to become almost a majority on a global scale. And he lumps together everyone from temporary workers, part-time workers, unemployed people, interns in Britain, but also the entire Chinese working class into this category. And it's completely incomprehensible. It makes a nonsense of trying to explain the world with reference to people's power in relation to labour. For us, the relationship rests on the power and the capacity of people to organise collectively, and we have a shared capability to do that, whether you're a part-time dinner lady, a factory worker, or a proletarian in China.
When I was a kid, I used to be a Boy Scout, confession, but one of the things that they used to do as a scout was bob a job. For the young people here, a bob with the old-fashioned 5 pence. And the idea was you'd go and knock on the door, somebody say, can we do a job for you? And they'd give you to clean their windows or do something, and they'd give you a shilling. And the nice people on the council estate where I live sometimes would give you £0.50, which was, I can't even remember what that is, 12.5p, right? And so we thought, me and my mates, we'd go to the big house, or one of the big houses up in Tetbury, where the royal family now live. We'd go to the big house, Chayden's house. So we went down to Chayden's house and asked if we could do Bob Job things. We're in the money. So he said, yep, this Philip lays the wind. Yeah, you can do this, you can do that, you can do this. We spent the whole morning raking his lawn and creosoting his fence, and the whole afternoon doing something else. Sawing wood. And then he comes down to us on his horse, you know, with another chap on his horse. Hey, you've done a fucking good job here. Take a florin, you know. So we'd worked there all day, and he thought he was doing the scouts a good thing. He'd give us 2 shillings, that's 2 bob. And we'd worked the whole day. Now, he went off on his horse, and we were thinking, bloody hell, this is wrong. And then the people from, when he'd gone, the people from the kitchen came out and said, come round here. And they give us milk straight out the cow, lovely, lots of digestive biscuits and everything. And they told us what a shitbag this really rich person was, and working in there. Now, the class thing's obvious there. I think I've got half a minute to say this. I was an engineer for many years. You could see the job change. When I went into it as an engineer, one of the first jobs I did was sort out the drawings. And there were some beautiful works of art with pen and ink and colour washes, and they were like artistic, right? And that's what I used to try to do. We used to do ink drawings, reinforced concrete, or drawings. You get down and do the sight lines, everything like that. as the 70s went on, that control, that changed. Process and procedures came in. You didn't have to think to do it. The art was taken out of it. And all the drawings looked the same because the computer-aided design, the job had been de-skilled, over a 10-year period. They took that control away. People become proletarianised. And when I went into the job, people would not have thought about strikes. When I come out of the job, most of us have been on strike 10 or 12 times, that's how things changed. They revolutionised the work process, and people who are white-collar workers are part of the working class.
Hi, my name is Joshua Brown. I'm originally from America, and I live in Scotland. I was born with a class consciousness, and I used to fight kids in school who gave me a hard time for not having the right trainers or not having the right haircut or whatever. That's where my class consciousness came from. Well, that and the fact that my mom never finished high school and had to clean houses for people that we considered to be rich at the time, but are actually not all that rich. They were just wealthier than us because we were dirt fucking poor. And I used to fight people for that. And I came to Glasgow and I met up with some amazing revolutionary socialists who are engaged in the struggle, who are also very well self-identified as working class and out there doing things. And I nearly got in a fight with one of them one day because he called me middle-class wanker. And I said, "Excuse me, comrade, I'm going to give you 3 sentences to explain myself, and if that's not sufficient, we're going to go outside and sort it out in the street." He's been through much the same as I have, but I wouldn't tolerate that. The problem is that we have to get beyond self-identifying as working class, and we need to use class as a weapon with which to defeat the fuckers who exploit us and oppress us and would see the back of us if they could. We have to get beyond that. So what do we do now? When I moved to Scotland, I worked for Aberdeen City Council, and I was involved in 2 strikes. I was 20-something years old, and I was in a strike for pensions and a strike for equal pay. So I stood up for older comrades, and I stood up for the women workers, and I felt absolutely fucking fantastic because it was the first time that I got to act my class politics as a trade unionist. Now I work for the Socialist Workers' Party, but I fight to get trade unions involved in the Scotland-wide anti-bedroom tax federation because the organised working class is going to help us liberate ourselves. Get involved, become a member of the organised working class in a trade union, and whatever work you're doing in the community, get them on board because they are the ones who can withdraw their labour and help us to beat the capitalists.
So I'm now going to ask Judith to attempt to address the many points that were raised in the few minutes left.
Yes, thank you. That was a great discussion, and clearly some people's early experiences have scarred them for a long time. Let's stay with the man and the horse. I'll not forget that in a hurry. Right, lots of questions. I'll try and answer them all. I'll stick around afterwards if I haven't answered them, but you've obviously got 2 more meetings which will go into some of the questions I think that were raised here. The upper class and its relationship with global capitalism. By the way, the 1%, 99% thing, I think it's a brilliant slogan, and it caught and captured something, but actually I think the ruling elites are a little more than 1% if we're going to be really technical about it, but that's just in passing. The upper class relationship to global capital. You see, when I talked about the ruling class being a band of warring brothers, I mean both within a national state and globally. And if you see the endless international summits, the European summits, the arguments in the ruling class and the Tories or amongst politicians and business people about whether catching on to the coattails of American capitalism is the way to go, or whether there's a need to be in the EU, these show, if you like, the constant tensions about where we are placed as British capitalism or as units of British capitalism. And I think that sense of what we've got today is, Marx talked about capitalism, the ever concentration, centralisation of units of capital, whether it is in, retail, the corner shop turning into the vast out-of-town supermarket, whatever. That's a very sort of simple, just a small example. But that sense of the constant centralisation, it means some units of capital, if in the crisis that we've just seen, if they went down, would pull down whole national economies. you know, that link, if you like, between, it's not the case that national borders don't matter, you know, that sense, there is globalization and borders crossing and huge trade and finances linked, but that sense of these huge chunks of capital, if you like, of almost, you know, the links to national economies are so enormous that that's the fear, isn't it, at the moment, that actually they could pull whole countries down, and that's why so many things that are too big to fail are being held up by state money, i.e. our money. But I think, so therefore the ruling class, there's not just one homogenous ruling class that all has a collective same interest. They have an interest in competing with each other. And if that answers the question, I hope it's the beginning of it. And I think that the other question which sort of links into that is the idea of the ruling class and the role of the media. Because, you know, people sort of talked about, you know, the media being something that tells us all this stuff, and it means we're kept down, it means we don't get to understand our true position in society, and the idea of the bread and circuses. I think there's definitely, you know, plenty of idea of bread and circuses to keep us all distracted. And you know, whether it's celebrity shows or all of this nonsense, if you like, it does. You know, obviously on one level it does distract people, and the idea that you can make it. You know, it's almost the celebrity version of everybody could be a president of America, which is rubbish, by the way. You know, that's why, you know, there's perhaps another Clinton coming on the back of a Clinton. There was a Bush on the back of another Bush. You know, this is hardly the whole of American society becoming the president. But, you know, in a celebrity culture, you know, obviously it is. You can make it, you can make it. I mean, Alan Sugar breaks through. But let's be clear, I don't want to be distracted by who's in the working class and who's not and everything else. But he ain't. He's not in the working class, however he speaks, you know. And I think that sense of, you know, if some people who came from a working class background end up as members of the ruling class and may sometimes talk in a working class accent, they are only in the ruling class on the back of the ability to labour, on the labour power of other workers. Therefore, they are part of a different class. It's, remember, if we keep coming back to the objective reality of your relationship to the means of production, not your consciousness, not what you think you are, not what you'd like to portray yourself as. You know, that's a difference. So the guy who came up earlier on, it said, you know, the people in my office don't realise they're working class. It's good, you fight, you talk about why there is a class divide, what side you're on and everything else. But actually in the long run, it's what matters is that they are. The objective reality is that they are, and conditions at different times can force them into acting as workers, even if they think, well, I'm not really. You know, and that's what we have to keep coming back to. That consciousness holds us back, but it doesn't actually change the material reality of your class position. And I think that, you know, the question about the unemployed, I think, has been answered. I mean, you know, also, you know, you have to think in Britain, you know, do you remember wasn't one of the Tories that wanted to go off, or some survey wanted to go off and find a family that was 3 generations of unemployed? Right, yeah. And they couldn't find this. You know, this idea that there's this whole sect, part of the working class that's permanently unemployed. You know, Cameron, he wants us to divide, as he said, you know, when you go to work and you see these curtains that are closed when you get up in the early, I mean, it's disgusting, absolutely disgusting. And but this idea that these people are permanently unemployed, you know, they're a leech on the class, are parasites to you and all. Number one, ideologically, it's filthy. But actually, it's not a reality, you know. And actually, every household or family will have maybe somebody who's unemployed, somebody who's working, somebody who's earning, somebody who's in part-time. You know, they're part of the working class, even in terms of how we live, let alone in terms of Marxist analysis of who they are. And actually, you know, let's just remember, you know, in terms of welfare benefits, where does the most of the welfare benefits go? Pensions and the working poor, you know. And not that I want to defend everybody who needs welfare benefits, but, you know, there is so many myths, filthy myths about what happens in our class that we have to say that we refuse to accept them. And I think the other one is this question of students. Because you see, if you look at the vast expansion of education, further education, you know, in the latter part of the 1960s and onwards, and comprehensive education, which for the first time for many working class people gave them access to an education that they hadn't had before, you had a real opening of possibilities, didn't you? Many working class people got to college and got jobs, and I think the comrade who talked about, you know, getting an education later in life and all the rest of it, it did change opportunities for people. People got degrees and went to university that would never have done before. But what's been happening? Then people had expectations, didn't they? Expectations of decent jobs and a different life than perhaps their mums and dads and grannies and grandpas. But actually, capitalism wasn't able to offer it, was it? And so actually, you have on the one hand the contradiction of sometimes the most basic jobs demand of you that you've got a degree, But at the same time, people go to college and think you've got all these opportunities, but you're not going to get these opportunities. And actually, I think one of the reasons that they're making it harder and harder for working class people to get to university because of fees and everything else is because they want to actually diminish our expectations because they can't fulfill them. And that in itself creates bitterness, anger, and sometimes struggle, which we've seen. And so that sense, again, that students are something separate, they're not. They're absolutely locked in to this, and actually the vast majority of them will end up being part of the working class. And I think that the other question that came up was this north-south thing about accents and about class divide and everything else. I think the north-south, I mean, this isn't what the comrade was exactly saying, but I think it touches on something that's very mainstream, is the fact that really the class divide is really about the north. That it's more deep in the north, or there's more consciousness of class in the north, and or else there's a north-south divide. Now the thing is, you look around bits of London, it's a really wealthy city, isn't it? But actually, you look around bits of London, it's a working class city. The class divide in London is huge, is really deep. I mean, there's a study that did, and I can't remember what station they started at, somewhere Kensington or Westminster, and every tube stop you go to the east, your life expectancy and infant mortality, your life expectancy goes down and infant mortality goes up as each tube stop as you go along. That's class. So, the sense that it may not be perceived in the same way sometimes, is something that actually we can't be fooled by. Because actually the divide is deep, and it goes to a situation where they always want to make us feel like maybe we're one up. Maybe we're just, we're not like those people. We're not, they want us to think that people up north are different and that we are okay, Jack. Or they want the people up north to think those Londoners have got everything. I mean, I was talking to some comrades in Leeds and saying, we need to look at this thing about the 500 benefit cap, because for some people who live where we live, that's a lot of money. And therefore they think, goodness, how could a 500 quid benefit cap, how could you not live on that? In London, that makes you utterly impoverished and perhaps will make you homeless, because of the cost of living here. So let's just understand what's going on here. It's a con to tell us that we have got more here than other parts of Britain. It's a con to say that we should be divided between the public sector and the private sector, or black and white, or women and men, or unemployed or employed, or pensioners or workers. These are all set to divide us, to make us less able to fight back. And I think what we have to finish with is where people have come to in several of their contributions. Our class, the working class, has got the power to change the world. It's got the power to bring around a socialist society. It's got the power to bring around not just economic equality, but economic equality opens the door for something different, doesn't it? The emancipation of the whole of humanity. That and no less is what we're fighting for.